Community is probably the most important thing.
Absolutely.
For living a life of excellence, for sure. Having that community that's got your back in bad times, good times, whatever. I mean, that's critical.
Welcome to the Zen Stoic Path. On this special segment of our episodes, we go into the liberated life interviews. These interviews go beyond the philosophy of Zen Stoic and go into people who are exemplary at showing us how to live a more liberated life from all facets or all contexts of life. In this episode, I have Dr. Dan Stickler, who is a dear friend and mentor of mine. Dr. Dan Stickler is the co-founder and chief medical officer at Apeiron. He is the pioneer behind systems-based precision performance medicine, a new paradigm that redefines medicine from the old symptoms-based disease model to one of limitless peak performance and system science in all aspects of life. Some of his positions include the clinical faculty of age management and medical group and American Academy of Anti-Aging Medicine, the medical director for the Neurohacker Collective and Kuya Medical, Scientific Advisory Board for True Diagnostics, Google Consultant for Wearable Technology, Epigenetics, and AI in Healthcare, and guest lecturer at the Stanford University on Epigenetics in Clinical Practice. Dr. Dan's systems approach has really helped me to change my life in a variety of ways, and I'm very grateful for the opportunity to have been able to get to know him and to have gone through some of the protocols that he has suggested to his clients. Now, Dr. Dan, like I was saying in his bio there, he doesn't just take the approach of medicine of, are you feeling well from a physical standpoint, but goes into a systems-based approach. Because like anything else in life, we are not just physical here, right? There are many different aspects of our life that contribute to the overall quality of life. And it's not just our physical well-being. This could go into our relationships. It can go into our financial health and the health of our business, or whether or not we're doing something that is truly fulfilling to us. And one thing that I really love that we talk about on this particular episode is the importance of going into states of wonder and awe and having ecstatic experiences. Being in a state of awe is something that is really key to our development and to staying young at heart and to staying curious when it comes to the way that we approach life. So without further ado, let's get into the show.
So we are here at the Apeiron Center, and this is definitely something that you've created out of inspiration, I'm sure. What originally inspired you to go down this road of helping people with their health and really exceeding the bounds of people's expectations around health, lifestyle, and vitality?
Well, it was originally what I had envisioned being a doctor would be. And when I got into medical school, I was a bit disenchanted by seeing it as it was very disease-oriented and pharmacologically oriented. It just didn't make much sense to me. But I stuck with it because I figured, maybe something would come around that was like about helping people be better.
Yes.
And I really didn't find it. When I did my rotations in internal medicine, family medicine, pediatrics, almost everything was this stepwise postponement of death. Somebody has an incident, they step down one, and you stabilize them there until their next drop. And so I ended up going into surgery because I loved working with my hands. And at least when somebody came in and they had a drop in their quality of life, I could just bring them back to baseline usually with surgery. And then I discovered a company called Synergenics out of Las Vegas back in 2004, 2005. And they were doing what I'd always imagined medicine was. They were taking healthy people or, people without chronic disease state, and they were working with them to be healthier and to prevent them from getting into that state. So I was like, oh, okay, this is what I really want to do. So I started as a hobby in my surgical clinic. I had this area that I did anti-aging medicine, they called it at the time. And then Micra joined that, and she kind of ran that practice because it was, like I said, it was a hobby for me. And then after about 5 years, I just one day decided I was done with surgery because I enjoyed the working with the clients in the age management group so much. And so all my attention focused there. And between Micah and myself, we just kind of brought everything together. I mean, we started off with, working with the body and the hormones. I mean, that was the main thing. And nutrition. I mean, nutrition was a key factor there. Then we added genetics, and then we added epigenetics. Then we added stress mitigations, and then we added cognitive procedures in there to optimize cognitive function. And now we're actually venturing into consciousness expansions, things that will increase the awareness of consciousness, help you to navigate consciousness levels. So
beautiful.
We just keep adding on to it and modifying as we go. So.
Well, that makes a lot of sense too, because the wellness that somebody experiences in their life, in their everyday life, it's not just limited to the physical body, right? There are the emotions that we have, the thoughts that we have, the spiritual experiences or consciousness oriented experiences that we have that seem to all play in. Like the more and more I've done work with my clients, the more I start to realize that all of those things are connected. And if you miss one of them, or you try to be single-minded focus in creating a solution for somebody's wellness or to bring somebody out of dis-ease, then you end up missing the mark, right? You get too tunnel vision on a single solution. What I think is cool is that I've always thought this around Western medicine, but it seems to be very problem focused, like you were saying, like very much like on disease prevention or getting somebody out of a problem, like an actual like physiological problem, into being at par, but not necessarily going off into like feeling good and enjoying one's life. What effect, you were in that world before. What effect did that have on you and how you looked at health, like previously versus now?
Well, it was interesting because in surgery, I thought at least it's not something that's lifestyle preventable. Then I realized actually 95% of the surgery I was doing was lifestyle preventable in some way or another. That naivete of not realizing lifestyle impacted so much of what I was doing in surgery allowed me to keep going with it until it didn't. And I was just like, oh, okay. Yeah. So now I'm going to go down this road because that's what I was passionate about. I I took a huge hit in income, I can tell you. But it was the best thing I ever did because I'm so passionate about what I do now. And how do people rate themselves? How do they rate life? And we use what's called a quality of life assessment.
I remember taking one of these.
And health is one of like 20 questions, 20 areas that we evaluate each year, because we looked at it and we were like, okay, are our clients improving in quality of life each year? That was our metric. It wasn't about, did they improve on this lab? Did they do this? Did they get better body composition? It doesn't matter what the numbers show. It's what they feel. And if their quality of life improves, we've done our job. And there's areas in that we talk about: home, relatives, community, love and relationship, self-worth, self-esteem. All of that is included in their financials. Yeah. Because what we found is that there's really 5 main areas that people come to us regarding. Health is obviously the physical side of it, this vehicle that carries our consciousness around. And second is the mind. Most people fear, because we do a lot of age rejuvenation work. Right. Most people, their fear is their cognitive function.
Right. Losing that cognitive function.
So we work with optimizing that. And especially now after COVID, people realized how fragile that cognitive function can be. People with long COVID are still having trouble functioning in their normal life again. And
you call it COVID brain, right?
Yeah, it is. Yeah. And they found that even in mild cases of COVID, there was a 0.3% shrinkage of the brain. Wow. Even in mild COVID. And that doesn't sound like a lot, but 0.3%, well, depending on your age when you have it, it can accelerate dementia by 20 years.
Wow.
Yeah. volume loss is very tiny in the brain, and the 0.3% is a big loss. So, we're getting a lot of people that we're working with to rejuvenate their cognitive function, get them back to baseline, because we measure, we do the brainwave mapping each year, so we can see before COVID, after COVID, how do we get you back to here at least? And,
that is, it's fascinating that you look at all of those areas of life when you are assessing somebody's health or their well-being, right? It's not like we were saying from the beginning, right? It's not just their physical well-being. It could be the way that they operate financially or the way that they operate in romantic relationship and how these things might affect somebody. And so measuring all of those is not something I've ever seen any doctor do, right? Just because.
Well, a lot of it is just subjective questions. Because like when we talk about mind, mindset is part of that.
Yes.
And we ask them about, do you have any deficiency mindsets? And they're like, well, what's a deficiency mindset? I said, do you worry about finances? Do you worry about your relationship? Do you worry about your children? What is it that occupies your brain? Maslow did, he wrote some work in his later years after the hierarchy of needs. And realized that deficiency states were the problematic area in progressing and transcending.
Wow.
And, he said, you have the poor beggar on the street whose goal is to get food to feed himself and his family. Well, is he going to take the time to learn the violin or to go learn a waltz or anything like that? He's not going to do that. His mind is occupied with, I need food. And that's his only focus. So he doesn't have the bandwidth to go into these other areas. But what people don't realize is the same is true with things like finances and love and relationships. And if there's deficiencies there, if you feel deficient in some way, you're going to be occupied by that.
Yeah.
And so the goal is to eliminate the deficiency states, or at least get people to start to understand that they don't need to be deficiency states. They're sufficient where they are. I mean, I see people that have net worths over $300, $400 million that are still worried about having enough money should something happen.
Should something happen with $300 or $400 million?
I'm just like, you got to be kidding me.
What exactly is going to happen?
I mean, it's crazy to see the financial deficiencies that people have.
Well, what do you think, creates that, especially in somebody who's at that level of wealth? What exactly would create that in somebody?
It's a deficiency state because you tend to be around the people that are in your general realm. Okay. So here's these 300, 400 million net worth people that are hanging around with 500, 700 million net worth people. And they're like, oh, I don't have enough to do what they're doing. It seems like 700 million is the cutoff that I've seen in my clients.
Yeah.
That's where the deficiency state goes away. They're not worried
they're like,
about
all right.
losing it. But yeah, it's very common that people have financial deficiencies.
That's fascinating. And one thing that I also thought was interesting that you were talking about is you were talking about Maslow's hierarchy of needs and how the beggar on the street would be consumed by looking for food for himself and his family in that. So what I think is fascinating is it seems as though, even though that is a less complex form of thinking, because it's just pretty like single-minded and like, what am I going to eat? How am I going to survive? It almost seems that even though it's a simpler train of thought or thinking, it consumes more energy of the person than when they're at a higher complexity of thinking, when they don't have to worry about that simple thing.
You would think.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Well, what do you feel like it is that makes those lower, less complex pursuit of needs more consuming of energy within ourselves?
I think because those are survival needs, whereas the higher needs are more of cognitive needs, perceived aspects.
Yes.
When you don't have shelter, you don't have food, you don't have water. I mean, that's a survival need.
Yes.
And the higher needs, even just like to have love. I mean, I have billionaires that don't have love, and they would give up everything they had for that one thing. So all of these, there's all these criteria that make us human, and drives the mind. I mean, you know, the mind, the ego is a very strong beast.
Yes.
And, not that it's a bad thing, but it's a necessity. But sometimes it gets a little out of control.
That's right.
And it makes us think that it's a survival need, when it's just a comfort need for a lot of people. But you know, the biggest fear people have is fear of death. And I know people that come here for age rejuvenation, that their whole reason for coming is because they're afraid of dying, and I won't work with them.
Right. They're trying to outrun the inevitable.
Yeah. I mean, that's just not what we do here. And that's not the mindset that will be successful in doing what we do. So mindset is really, really important.
Yes. So for somebody who comes in who has a fear of dying, what is the reason that you wouldn't work with someone like that?
Just because their deficiency state.
So
they have a life deficiency state, because they are so afraid of death, and trying to do everything they can to avoid it. And me treating them is actually feeding that.
Yeah, it's indulging in that fear. And that fear, I think what's interesting about it is that anytime somebody really fears death, or they have like an irrational level of fear around death, meaning like they're walking around every day trying to do everything that they can to avoid it, instead of living their life, what I find is interesting is they're typically afraid to live.
Exactly.
And so that in and of itself would create a lot of deficiencies in terms of how they show up in the world.
Well, there's an interesting question we ask people. We'll say, describe your most recent experience of awe, or your most recent peak experience.
Yeah.
And when they can't think of one, they're not living life.
Right.
I mean, I've had people sit there and go, I can't think of anything. I was like, did you have children? Oh, yeah, when my child was born. When was that? 21 years ago.
Like that was the last awe experience.
Wow.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's a good litmus test to understand if people are really living life, you know, being the Übermensch, as Nietzsche referred to them.
Yes.
Or are they the last man, the person seeking the greatest comfort and the least pain? That's okay, but that's not living life.
Correct. No, I find that fascinating, because with my clients, the way that I'm assessing typically is looking at the quality of their emotional health and how they're showing up emotionally. Because it seems like the role that emotions play in our lives is they signal to us when we're doing something that is good for ourselves subjectively, or is not so good for ourselves. And so looking at the way that those emotions interact with a person's life can determine the quality of their life, right? Like you were saying, the billionaire who doesn't have love and would give literally everything that they had in order to get love, there seems to be like a very large emotional debt that comes with that deficiency state that they're trying to fulfill over and over and over again with no avail, because it cannot be filled with external things. It needs to be filled by that feeling that they would have in relation to another person.
Correct.
So how do these deficiency states affect a person physiologically? Like what effects can they have on the body if somebody's carrying around these states?
Well, any state that causes some stress in the body, and if you feel a deficiency, you're stressed about something. So it's a stress response that the system has. You're going to have increased inflammatory markers, increased cortisol. They're going to have decreased sleep and sleep quality. I mean, it's just you want to talk about aging. Deficiency states are one of the biggest things that are going to contribute to the rapidity of the aging.
Yeah, that's very interesting. So the very people who are afraid to die, who are coming for the anti-aging, are accelerating with that thought alone.
Yeah. I know that's going to cause a lot of anxiety for people. They'll be like, Okay, stop worrying.
That's right. which is interesting, right? Because at least, we talked about this topic on your podcast, last time we were recording about the whole school of thought of NLP. And that's something that I recently went through and did a training on to be able to certify others. And one of the things that we talk about a lot in NLP is this idea that the unconscious doesn't process negations. So if you're saying, I don't want to die, or I'm like afraid to die, or if like, I just want to prevent aging, then your unconscious mind is just hearing the signal of the subject of what you're saying, not necessarily the context of what you're saying.
Yeah.
And it perpetuates, and we start to focus in on that area.
Yeah. The words that we use drive our thoughts and our emotions and all of that. We talked about this, the fact that words are one of the worst ways to communicate.
Yeah, they are.
Nobody, it's rare that you're in a shared consensual reality with another person, but we assume we are all the time.
Right. Because the words that we use, we assume that they mean the same thing to us that they mean to the other person. But one of the things that we were talking about, not assuming that whoever's listening or watching this has heard ours, because I'm sure they'll come out at different times. But one of the things that we talked about is how different words for different people elicit different images in the mind, right? Different internal representations of reality. And how if one person says one word and it brings up a really pleasant, positive image in their mind is going to, go into the state that's reflected of that positive image. But if that same word creates something negative in someone else's mind, then it's going to put them in a negative state. One of the words that I've recently changed with that is maybe not the word, but the concept of when I think of discomfort. And I made this distinction earlier this year because I was going into these really fight or flight states around finances and business. Even though everything was perfectly fine, I had a roof over my head, I had food, I had my needs met, so to speak, but I was having a similar response to what you were describing earlier. And the distinction that I made is being uncomfortable is not the same thing as being unsafe.
Right.
And some people, when they feel uncomfortable, they think, or their mind shows them imagery that says, I'm not safe. Which when I think of unsafe, I think of physiological danger. Something bad could happen. I can get injured. I can get killed in something. And if somebody's responding to discomfort with the same level of response that they would respond to that, I'm sure it could create quite a degree of stress in the body.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Well, the interesting thing is I have people take their fear to worst possible outcome. Tell me what would be the worst thing that would happen if you didn't have enough money to pay rent and live in your home.
Are you asking? Oh yeah. I mean, the worst thing that could happen, because
if you financially just collapsed tomorrow,
I would have to ask, people that I loved and cared about for help.
And would they help you?
Yeah.
Okay. So what are you worried about?
Exactly.
That's what I say. Community is probably the most important thing.
Absolutely.
For living a life of excellence, for sure. Having that community that's got your back in bad times, good times, whatever. That's critical.
100%. It reminds me a lot of Alan Watts, and he would say, you can't satiate your hunger by reading a menu.
Yeah.
Just money doesn't make you rich, but what does that do for you? What does it represent? We don't confuse wealth for money. In other words, it goes back to what we were talking about the other day is, the finger pointing at the moon is not the moon, right? We assume that money and finances point to safety, security, pleasure, wealth, and all the above, depending on the person. But at the end of the day, those things are better fulfilled with other areas of our life, community being one of them. I consider myself very wealthy just based on the community of people that I have in my life, the friendships that I have, the relationships. That is where there's a serious amount of abundance by comparison to anything else in my life. And I attribute that to my own well-being, mentally, emotionally, even physically, being feeling as though I'm taken care of and supported. And
I've been through a process in the last year where I just didn't understand the point of anything like work. I was like, why are we working?
What are we doing here?
What's the point? I mean, and I was talking with Micah, and I'm like, we have our love, and even if we lost everything, we'd be fine.
That's
it
right.
Wouldn't be an issue. And so I was like, why are we pushing to like grow the business? And I said, I don't want to put the effort in to do that if it takes away from the time of community, of our relationship, of getting outdoors and doing things.
Yeah. Living life, essentially.
Yeah. And granted, having money, you can have a much more luxurious experience, but it doesn't change the experience. I mean, the experience is still the experience. And I'm just now starting to come out of this. I don't understand the need for work and everything. I've kind of balanced it. Just in the last couple of weeks, it's kind of coming around like, oh, I enjoy creating.
That's
this
right.
isn't work. But when things come up that are work, I can still feel that like, don't want to do that.
Yeah. Yeah, it's interesting. I sometimes have my clients who, they have larger teams just take note and have some awareness around their day. Anytime they're doing something at work that feels like work, and when they're doing something that feels like play. Because typically what I've seen is, and this is not an absolute statement, but this is just a tendency that I've noticed, is that when people are engaged in the work stuff that actually feels like play to them, they're operating at their highest level of contribution and output. So in other words, they can give the most value in that state of being versus when they're doing something that feels like work.
Yeah.
And typically one of the taskings that we have is that they start to delegate that stuff. And people are amazed at how this changes the not just the feeling of going to work and their business, but it also improves the finances. It improves the organization, the overall like operational flow of everything. So it's fascinating how when we look at that, like what feels like play, what allows me to kind of have this enjoyment.
We just hired people that felt like spreadsheets and process were play.
Right.
And I'm like, cool. Okay.
Yeah. Go on. Knock yourself out.
Here's my concept.
Yeah.
Put it into something that works.
Exactly.
And they love that. And
yeah.
It makes my life fun.
Yeah. It's wonderful how that works too. Speaking about health and getting out of these deficiency mindsets, what role does play have in it, in your viewpoint?
Oh, huge. If people don't have active play every single day, they're going to be deficient in play. And it can be at work. Like what we're doing right now.
Yeah.
We're here. It's a work week, and we're sitting here having a great conversation.
Yeah, just hanging out and talking. Exactly. Yeah. This is 100% play.
Yeah. So it's just finding what you're passionate about, and it may be something that, is a whole career change for you, but it's worth it.
That's right. I agree 100%. I think I always kind of come back. I've been asking myself this question lately when I'm thinking about doing tasks that I would rather hire out for. And I start to ask myself, because sometimes there's a little voice of family and those I was raised with were like, oh, just do it yourself, you'll save the money. And then I seem to counter that question. Well, what's the money for actually?
Yeah.
Like, what's the purpose of this? Is it so that I can have more of it and feel the way that I'm feeling now consistently, where I'm stressed out? Like, doesn't sound like a very good use of that money, does it? So if I wouldn't do it for that price that I'm willing to pay out, then I'm going to go ahead and send it out there.
Right.
And I've noticed that has a big difference. Like when I feel like a joy to hire or outsource, a part of my business out, it actually makes more room for that play. And thus the output of my work becomes more effective. And weirdly enough, more money comes in.
That's when we step back from trying to grow the business.
Mm-hmm.
The business started growing naturally.
Right.
But we weren't putting the effort into it to make it happen. And it just happened.
Yeah.
But we also hired people on our team that were more aligned with the duties that required to grow a little bit more.
That's right.
So I don't think it was the business stepped away from it, but Mike and I stepped away from driving growth.
Beautiful. Because that felt like work to you.
Yeah.
Right. And
a work that I didn't quite understand why.
Right. Right. I think what's interesting about that is, we were talking about intentions and delusions, and, when we were discussing last week, and what's fascinating is that the intentions are designed to point one back to their humanity, to their individual experience, to be totally present within it, to be perfectly and simply human. And then the delusions are pointing towards an abstraction. So like an abstract idea of like, well, we have to grow the business because that's the right thing to do. And
good metaphor.
Yeah, exactly.
Grow.
Yeah, grow the. Yeah, exactly. Good metaphor. And that's another thing that we had a lot of discussion about was, the way that metaphors play, and especially when we're doing things that are not actually adding to our experience, but actually subtracting from it. We use metaphors to justify, well, this is the right thing to do. This is what I should be doing. And I think that's fascinating because I basically designed, as part of my coaching training and program, a Zen Stoic rendition of the Buddhist Eightfold Path, right? Like an updated rendition. And one of the parts of that is integral livelihood. And the essence of it is, like at a very high level, is whatever you do for work to support yourself in this life, you want it to actively contribute to your liberation, not detract from it.
Are you using that in the context of Ken Wilber's integral?
I'm not too familiar with Ken Wilber, but I would love if you could speak to Ken Wilber's stuff here for.
He's just a transpersonal psychologist that. I think he's a psychologist. I'm not sure, but he's very well known in the consciousness community, and he has these scales for levels of consciousness, but it's all based on integral theory and complexity, which is my favorite areas. So it kind of combines everything that I like.
Yeah,
I'm surprised you haven't heard of Ken Wilber.
I mean, I've heard his name. I haven't gone into his work quite yet. The reason why I use the word integral is because the original translation of the Eightfold Path, at least the English translation, the Western one, is right, like right livelihood, right view, and right kind of implies wrong as well, like a dichotomy there. And the original the original way that it's said in Sanskrit is samyak, which is more, it describes like total or complete view, or like a, not a tunnel vision, but more of like a, everything in unity and entirety type of view. So I use the word integral because it is essential and necessary to the whole of one's liberation.
Yeah.
So when I think about the livelihood, one of the things that's talked about there is if it detracts from your liberation, then you're not doing the right thing for yourself, right? Yeah. And that can happen in a variety of ways, right? If depending on what perspective we're talking about it from, if we're talking about it from a morality perspective, or like a societal law perspective, then livelihood that wouldn't be integral livelihood would be things like illegal activity or activity that takes advantage of other people, because at least in the philosophy that I espouse, that creates emotional debt within the individual who's perpetuating that stuff. So if one's work is actively creating liberation for themselves by putting them in this state of play on a more consistent basis, then ultimately they move closer and closer to their own liberated life.
Yeah. I like that.
Yeah. So for you, I mean, I usually ask this question towards the end, but since we're kind of going into it now, it makes sense. What does it mean to you to live a liberated life?
A liberated life. Again, terms that we have different meanings for.
Yeah.
Because what I would refer to it as is a life of excellence. So, at the end of the day, when we're on our deathbed, asking yourself the question, did somebody know I existed? And if you can answer that in a positive way, then I think you've lived a good life. But for me, living life is about really just sucking the essence out of it. It's like you want to know love. You want to know peak experiences. You want to experience awe on a daily basis. You want to have a community where people are just fun to be around. A life of excellence, and it doesn't necessarily mean like a really peaceful life. Okay. Like I always use the example of Mother Teresa. Would you say she lived a life of excellence?
Oh yeah.
Of course she did.
Yeah.
But, look at her life. She left her family as a teenager, never to see them again, to go into a convent in Ireland where she trained. And then she ended up in India and she was there for a couple of years, but wanted to work. She got a message from God that she needed to leave the convent. So she just left one day. And she was a beggar on the street for like 2 weeks or something.
Wow.
And the women from the convent would come to her and say, just come back. Why are you doing this? And she said, no, I have to. And then she worked with the poorest of the poor, the lepers. She saw human misery on a daily basis, but she was happy.
Yeah.
Even though she felt their pain and their sorrows, she was happy and she was there helping them. So, she wouldn't lead a life of like these TikTok influencers that show all this fun stuff that they do.
Yeah. Record themselves feeding somebody a sandwich. Yeah. Like, look how good I am.
Right. Some of the stuff. But living a life of excellence is one that you feel like, yes, I did something. And I experienced as much as I could out of life. It's truly the Übermensch of Nietzsche. It's like, take the risks for the great rewards, but also be accepting of the great fails too.
Yes.
And the depths of sorrow will only be matched by the heights of ecstasy.
That's right. Which are peak experiences as well.
Yes.
Because I feel like, at least when I used to hear the idea of a peak experience, I would immediately associate to positive,
right? Like
positive or pleasant emotion. But what I've noticed is that you can have peak experiences of unpleasant emotion, like sadness, and it can still be profoundly beautiful.
Yeah. To
experience that.
It's usually not when you're in it.
Not when you're in it. It's like as you're like coming out, you're like, oh.
I can remember the first time. Yeah. The first time I did it, because I'd always blunted painful or sad experiences. So I would distract myself from actually experiencing them. And this one time I had this sadness and I just decided to dive all the way into it, take it as far down as I could get it. And it was so painful to experience that. And then when I kind of came out of it, I was like, oh my God. I was in awe of what that felt like.
Yeah.
I was just like, okay, it didn't feel great, but
not while I was in it.
Amazing.
Yeah, but I'm pretty blown away by how that felt.
And it, letting all of that out at that depth is just so cathartic.
Oh, absolutely. We had a whole conversation about this when we originally met, the importance of feeling your emotions and feeling your feelings.
Yes.
Because allowing them to pile up within you usually doesn't result in very pleasant experiences. One very specific thing that has happened, at least in my life and in a few of my clients that I've had the privilege to help with, is it shows up as pain.
Yeah.
It shows up as chronic pain in the body. And I had chronic pain in my back for 20 years and just got used to it as though it was some kind of a normal thing. When the reality is I was doing something similar to what you described, where I was blunting my emotions.
It's amazing how that catches in the physiology.
Yeah.
I think it was a herniated disc in my neck a couple months ago. And I was exploring every possible thing, emotional thing, and any shadow work that I had that was causing this and everything. I mean, it could have been just the herniated disc, or a bulging disc. But after about 6 weeks of daily pain between 7 and 10, it just spontaneously resolved. So I'm not sure if I actually had a physical ailment or if it was truly something psychological that was pressing on me.
Yeah. I've always noticed that, at least for myself, and I don't know how accurate this is, but it's just kind of what I've used for myself to kind of modulate that, is if it lasts more than like a month and a half, 2 months, then it's probably psychological, or there's something psychological there, right? And I can start to dive into, like, if there's no improvement whatsoever in that period of time, I'm like, okay, I feel like my body would know a little better than this to at least make some kind of incremental improvement. So let me dive into it. One thing that you had said that I think was really interesting is this idea of being in awe or peak experience, and how sometimes when you ask that of somebody, they haven't had one in a decade or two. If somebody's listening to this now and they're resonating with that part of not having had a peak experience, what's like the first thing that you would advise somebody to do if they're, kind of realizing this as they listen?
Pay attention to them. That's, it's just like when you're thinking about buying a certain car and all of a sudden you see that car everywhere.
Yeah.
You can do that with states of awe, and really expand. I mean, I can get awe states from reading an article. I can experience, my favorite one was, my wife and I were walking around in the backyard, and there was this, that stuff that looks like spit on a blade of grass. And I was like, where does that spit come from? And she's like, well, maybe it's a bird. And I'm like, no, birds don't have saliva. They're dry mouth typically. And we were just kind of confused by it. So to me, that was a state of awe. We're like, why? Yeah,
just what? Not understanding.
And then I looked it up on the computer, and there was this really cool entomologist from Pittsburgh. He had a real strong Pittsburgh accent. I'm from Pittsburgh, so I appreciated it. Yeah. But he was talking about this. Yeah. And what it turns out, they're called spit bugs. And they're these insects that suck the water out of the blade of grass. And while they're sucking the water out, they blow bubbles out their butt to cover them and conceal them. And that was another state of awe. Just knowing that. All right. Like, oh my God. That's a great piece of useless knowledge.
That's right. That's really interesting. It reminds me of our conversation when we talked intentions and delusions, when we talked the difference between control and understanding. And what's really fascinating is that being confused or not understanding something, being like unaware of how something works, can produce that state of awe. So if somebody, theoretically speaking, if somebody's moving into their life or into all situations with an intention to control things, to keep things in the comfort zone of their box, they will actually inhibit them the ability to have a state of awe, to have that like, what is this kind of experience, right? Or just like, assume that it's one thing, just to keep them calm internally about what they know and don't know. Yeah.
And that has been a big change for me.
That's amazing. Well, I'm sure, especially as a doctor, right? Like
comfortable with uncertainty.
Yes.
That's the one thing people just do not, our brains, our minds do not like uncertainty. It wants to be certain about everything. And it's just, it will predict things and have us perceive something that isn't actually true. You've seen the thing where they have the two gray blocks that are on angles like this. They look like it, but you're facing them straight. And one in the bottom's darker and one on the top is light, because that's what our brain assumes is going to happen.
Mm-hmm.
But if you put your finger across and block the line,
Mm-hmm.
you see that they're both the same color, but you pull your finger away and they're obviously different colors.
Yeah.
And you're like, what? What's up with that?
Yeah.
It was just like the blue dress. What was it? Blue and black dress versus
Yeah.
the gold and white dress.
Yeah.
You know, people,
I remember that.
I mean, that was a huge internet
Mm-hmm.
flurry over it. And it has a lot to do with the brain predicting what it was seeing based on what it assumed the light was doing in there. And
Very
so everybody was right,
Yeah.
but they weren't in consensus.
That's really fascinating. Especially, it's almost like making assumptions is like a survival instinct.
Mm-hmm.
Like we don't know something, so
Like
we try to fill that gap.
The brain wants certainty.
So obviously, like you help people on a physiological level, on an emotional level, spiritual level, and you talked about how you're bringing in consciousness to this whole modality of creating wellness and vitality in a person. When we think about that, one's like, well, the brain, evolutionarily speaking, is saying that it wants certainty and it's uncomfortable with uncertainty.
Mm-hmm.
So when we think about like, well, the human is designed that way and let's get comfortable with uncertainty, what is the purpose of doing so? Like just from like an evolutionary standpoint, like transcending into that mindset.
Because when you get comfortable with uncertainty, you get a closer perception of reality, I think.
Mm-hmm.
And you also lose a lot of the deficiency states.
Mm.
I mean, I went to the extreme with it and basically had the mantra of I know nothing.
Mm.
I mean, I am confident in nothing. That's and that was the plain truth. I mean, I had come from a scientific method background where if you couldn't prove it, it didn't exist. And you couldn't even use it to say that it was doing something if you couldn't prove it to me. But then, in deep dives with quantum physics, a little bit of plant medicines to facilitate the process, I realized that we really don't know anything. I mean, things that we assume, and we knew this in medicine. I mean, you look at journals from 10 years ago and they're talking about things that you're like, oh my God, what were they thinking back then?
Yeah.
But that was like the rule. I mean, that's how it existed. I remember when I started as a surgery resident, we were doing the initial studies of sentinel node biopsy. So instead of removing half the chest and the underarm area of all of its lymph nodes and tissue, called a radical mastectomy, we started doing this where we would take out the tumor and then check for the sentinel node, which is the first node that drains from that region of the breast, send it to pathology and have pathology tell us whether there was cancer in it or not. And even if there were, we would just still take out the nodes in the armpit rather than, just removing all of the breast tissue. And nobody had ever questioned like radical mastectomies before. And it was such a brutal procedure. But then we realized, no, you don't have to do that. There's a much more conservative way to go about healing this.
Interesting.
So
how those things, they transcend over time.
Everything you think you know, tomorrow you probably will be questioning. And that's when you just say, okay, I don't know anything, so I have to be comfortable with uncertainty.
That's right.
It's just the way it is.
Yeah, I think there's a great utility in being able to hold the truths that you espouse loosely, and to you can allow them to guide you so that you can function on a regular basis, but simultaneously being open to them being disproven or changed in some way. And the comfort with that uncertainty kind of goes back to what we were talking about before, where I was saying there's a very big difference between discomfort and unsafe, or like not being comfortable and not being safe.
Discomfort is just really uncertainty. Unsafe is certainty.
Yes, absolutely. That's very true. So it's fascinating how people would do that, make that little switch in their minds.
Mm-hmm.
So I know it's definitely been very beneficial for me to make that little distinction, but has created a very big difference, right? Because then I'm able to learn, I'm able to actually embrace the I don't know experience as an opportunity, or as an experience of awe, of just being like totally like blown away by how this thing came to be, so to speak.
Right.
So before we wrap up, one question I did want to ask you is, you talk about this idea of living a life of excellence, and I suppose what I'm curious about for the audience is, like, somebody's listening to this and they resonate with this idea of living a life of excellence. What can they do to start, or like how can they recognize where they're at, and then how can they begin to sort of assess like where they are with that?
Yeah, I would look at like I said at the beginning, and I never really finished this, but there are five areas that we find that will impact quality of life the most. One is the health. Okay, so you got to have a healthy vehicle, because otherwise you can't do the things you want to do.
Correct.
The mind, get rid of the deficiencies, get rid of that deficiency mindset, and really give up the need to be certain is a big one. Then the third area is peak experiences. Go out and look for peak experiences. Look for states of awe in even the most minor things in a day, and just make it a habit of saying, I'm going to have at least one awe experience, or even like an experience of profound gratitude for something, and just sit with that for a moment each day. Have one thing that does that, and you'll start realizing those start coming on a more regular basis. The other thing is really, well, we kind of group these together, but purpose and community. You've got to feel like you're a contributor to a community. That's important for people. And if they don't feel like they're contributing to a community, then they do have a diminished quality of life. And then the last one is love.
Yeah.
And it doesn't have to be for a partner. It can be for a dog or something like that, but just to experience love in your life. I mean, that's a key thing to living a life of excellence, is to have the experience of love.
Absolutely. Dan, thank you so much for being on the show.
All right.
It's great to have you.
Yeah.